My parents drained my college fund from my sister's private school and vacations, then were shocked when my grandparents gave me the family house. My younger sister, Mia, recently finished high school, but her path was anything but smooth. She had already dropped out twice, and this was her third and final attempt. Mia had always found school challenging. From early on, academics weren't her strength. She constantly struggled to keep up with her classmates, not only with grades but also with staying focused and motivated, which made things even harder for her. At first, Mia claimed she had ADHD, hoping that would explain her difficulties. But after several evaluations, doctors dismissed that possibility. Without that excuse, Mia's behavior started to spiral. She began hanging out with an older crowd, often getting into trouble. There were multiple occasions when she was caught sneaking off during school hours to meet up with them. She'd skip entire days just to attend parties, leading to frequent calls from her teachers to my parents. My parents were constantly stressed and unsure of what to do. They tried reasoning with her, but that didn't work. Grounding her was pointless too. Mia would find ways to sneak out late at night to meet friends or strangers she met online. Instead of holding Mia fully accountable, my parents often directed their frustration toward me. They'd accuse me of not being a supportive older sister, insisting it was my job to set an example and help guide her. I cared deeply about Mia and wanted to help, but she never listened. Every time I tried to steer her away from risky decisions, she'd get defensive and shut me out. Eventually, I gave up trying to intervene. The constant arguments were exhausting, and I felt powerless. It was easier to keep the peace, even though I knew it wasn't helping Mia make better choices. One early morning, everything came to a head. My mom, Diane, woke up and, as part of her routine, checked on both of us. When she entered Mia's room, she found it empty. I woke up to my mom's panicked screams, calling for me and my dad, Paul. Confused and half asleep, I rushed to Mia's room, hoping to find a note or some clue, but there was nothing. We tried calling Mia, but her phone was off, which only heightened the panic. Just as we were about to call the police, one of Mia's friends messaged me privately, revealing that Mia had gone to meet someone she had connected with online. My heart sank as I told my parents. Thankfully, the friend had the guy's address because Mia had shared it with her earlier. We immediately got into the car and drove there. When we arrived, my mom didn't hesitate. She stormed into the house, calling out for Mia. When Mia saw us, her face turned pale with shock and embarrassment. Fortunately, nothing dangerous had happened. The guy seemed just as surprised as we were. Apparently, Mia had lied about her age, convincing him she was older. My dad, furious, gave the guy a stern warning before pulling Mia out and taking her home. The car ride back home was nothing short of chaotic. The car echoed with shouting, Mia arguing defiantly with our parents while Mom desperately tried to get her to understand how dangerous her actions had been. The tension in that car was suffocating. I don't think I've ever experienced a more draining ride. Mia was livid with me, blaming me for involving our mutual friend to track her down. She kept snapping that she would have just come home later and that I should have kept quiet. It was clear she didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation or realize how terrified we all were. When we finally got home, Mom grounded her immediately. I naively thought this terrifying ordeal might finally push Mia to change, but that hope faded quickly. Instead, something unexpected happened. Mom and Dad became overly protective, almost to the point of enabling her. They were so scared of something happening to Mia again that they started giving in to her demands, hoping that would keep her safely at home. Mia, sharp as ever, noticed the shift right away. She realized that as long as our parents were afraid of her running off again, they'd bend over backward to keep her happy. And she used that to her advantage. Even when she failed high school the first time, I expected there'd be consequences, some tough love, maybe a serious intervention. But instead, Mom and Dad barely addressed it. Rather than confronting the issue, they tiptoed around it, telling her they understood how tough school could be and encouraging her to try again, almost as if failing was no big deal. They thought they were being supportive, but in reality, they were making things worse. Their leniency only reinforced Mia's belief that she didn't have to take responsibility for her actions. Every mistake she made was brushed aside with excuses. When she repeated high school the second time, things spiraled further. Mia got caught cheating on an important exam and was suspended. I thought this would finally be the breaking point, that Mom and Dad would step up and discipline her properly. But instead, they sympathized, blaming the pressure of school for her poor choices. It wasn't long after that when Mia hit rock bottom. Feeling humiliated and left behind as her friends moved on with their lives, she dropped out of high school completely. She got a job at a local bar, saying she needed to make money and figure things out on her own. Our parents didn't give up on her, though. They tried countless times to convince her to go back to school, even urging me to talk to her. I knew it would be tough, but I also knew she couldn't work at a bar forever. After many conversations filled with frustration and hope, Mia finally agreed to give school one last shot. Mom and Dad pulled some strings and paid for her to enroll in a private school that would accept her despite her past record. This time, I kept a close eye on her, and surprisingly, she put in genuine effort. She studied hard, passed her exams, and eventually graduated. I was incredibly proud of her. To celebrate, I took her out to dinner. That night, instead of heading back to my apartment near campus, I decided to stay over at our parents' house. I was exhausted and figured spending the night in my old room wouldn't hurt. The next morning, I woke up to the warm, familiar smell of cinnamon. Mom's cinnamon rolls were something of a family legend. The scent instantly brought back childhood memories, and I rushed downstairs, excited. As I neared the kitchen, I overheard Mom and Dad speaking in low voices. When I entered, they fell silent, their faces tense. I asked what was going on, but Mom quickly brushed it off, forcing a smile and saying everything was fine. She then suggested I stay the whole day and have dinner with them. Though I had planned to head back to college, her insistence convinced me to stay. That evening during dinner, Dad raised a toast, saying how proud they were of both Mia and me. Mom smiled warmly, echoing his sentiments. Then, turning to Mia, they asked if she'd started thinking about college. Mia's face lit up. She excitedly shared that she had applied to several universities, even aiming for some Ivy League schools, inspired by where I studied. Hearing her talk so optimistically about her future, especially after all the chaos, was genuinely heartwarming. It felt like, after everything, Mia was finally starting to believe in herself. Mia was beaming with excitement as she talked about her future, especially after everything she had endured in high school. Mom and Dad listened closely, nodding and smiling as she spoke. But then, their attention shifted to me. There was an odd pause, longer than comfortable, and the way they looked at me felt off, like there was something important they hadn't yet said. Dad finally cleared his throat, but I could hear the unease in his voice. He started by mentioning that with Mia soon heading to college, he and Mom had been having some tough discussions. Then, he dropped the bombshell. They had decided they could no longer afford to pay for my college tuition. I just sat there, stunned, struggling to process what I had just heard. Mom quickly jumped in, trying to soften the blow. She explained that they had always planned to renovate the house, but had put it off because they were focused on supporting me financially. Now, with Mia starting college, they'd need to dip deeper into their savings that were also meant for their retirement. She said it only seemed fair that I begin covering my own expenses since I was an adult, and they couldn't support both of us through college. My head was spinning. How was I supposed to pay for school? I had a part-time job, but my savings wouldn't even last a semester. The idea of taking out massive loans to finish the last 2 years of my degree felt overwhelming. I glanced at Mia, who looked equally shocked. While I was genuinely proud of her for finally turning things around, it stung that after all my hard work, I was being told to fend for myself while they continued fully supporting her. I tried to stay calm and asked if they planned to only cover Mia's first 2 years, like they had done for me, and if she'd be expected to pay her own way after that. They didn't answer. Their silence told me everything. Eventually, Mom spoke up, saying that Mia was more vulnerable and needed the extra support. They were afraid that if they didn't cover everything, she might drop out again. To them, it made sense, but to me, it felt like betrayal. I wasn't just asking for handouts. I wanted them to finish what they had started. I had worked hard, followed the rules, and now I was being left halfway through. I pushed back, trying to explain how unfair this was, but Dad cut me off. His frustration was obvious. He said if I couldn't afford the fees, I could always take a year off, work full-time, and save up. According to him, taking a gap year was no big deal. But to me, it was a crushing blow. I had worked so hard to stay on track, and now I was being told that it didn't matter. After that dinner, I was completely lost. Mia, surprisingly, was just as upset about the situation, but I told her not to argue with our parents. The last thing I wanted was for them to pull her funding too, leaving both of us stuck. A few days later, Mia came to me with an idea I hadn't considered, asking our maternal grandparents for help. They were well off, and growing up, both Mia and I had spent plenty of time with them. I hesitated at first. It felt awkward, but with no better options, I decided to give it a shot. I took a bus to their town, hoping they could help. When I arrived, they were genuinely happy to see me. It had been a while since my last visit, and they welcomed me with warm hugs and bright smiles. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was there. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. After we sat down and caught up, I finally opened up. I told them everything, how Mom and Dad had decided to stop paying for my college, and how I didn't know how I was going to manage. It was hard to talk about. I tried to stay composed, but my voice cracked a few times. My grandparents listened quietly, concern written all over their faces. Finally, I asked them if they could loan me some money, just enough to help me finish my degree. I made it clear that it would be a loan, and that I was committed to paying them back as soon as I could. I didn't want them to think I was just looking for a handout. Even as I sat there, waiting for their response, I couldn't help but feel guilty for putting them in that position. It felt like I was crossing a line, but at that moment, I didn't see another way forward. My grandparents seemed visibly taken aback by my request. They exchanged confused glances before my grandfather asked, "Why would you need more money when you already have a college fund?" I blinked, completely confused. "What college fund?" I asked. That's when my grandfather revealed something that completely blindsided me. He explained that years ago, he and my grandmother had set up two separate college funds, one for me and one for Mia. When I turned 18, they handed both funds over to my parents, trusting them to manage the money responsibly and use it exclusively for our education. Apparently, that's how my parents had been covering my tuition up to this point. My grandparents had been under the impression that Mia and I were fully covered and simply told me to ask my parents for the rest of my fund. I was stunned. I sat there, trying to process what I had just heard. My parents had never once mentioned anything about a college fund. Not to me, not to Mia. All these years, we thought they were paying for our education out of their own savings. My head spun with questions. Why hadn't they told us about this fund? Where had the money gone? If not on tuition, what had they spent it on? The deeper I thought about it, the more betrayed I felt. They had let me believe that I'd have to take out massive loans or even drop out, all while having a fund that could have easily covered my remaining tuition. I couldn't let it go. Right there in my grandparents' living room, I pulled out my phone and called Mom. I put her on speaker so my grandparents could hear everything. I needed answers. When she answered, I got straight to the point. Mom, can you tell me about the college fund Grandpa and Grandma gave you for me? There was a long pause on the other end. I could tell immediately she was caught off guard. Her hesitation only confirmed my growing suspicions. Finally, she spoke, but instead of answering, she asked, "Who told you that?" I told her the truth, that I had visited my grandparents, and they were the ones who informed me. Her tone changed instantly. She sounded upset, almost defensive. "You shouldn't have gone behind our backs like that," she snapped. Then she added, "The money your grandparents gave us wasn't just for college. It was meant for the family as a whole." Before she could spin it any further, my grandfather, who had been sitting silently beside me, interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. "When we gave you that money, Diane, we were very clear it was meant only for the kids' education," he said sharply. "Nothing else?" The line went quiet. Then he followed up, asking the question I was dreading. "So where did that money go, Diane? Why isn't it paying for Chloe's last 2 years of college?" Another long silence. Eventually, Mom spoke, her voice softer now. I need to talk to Paul," she mumbled. "He's the one who's been handling all the finances." It was a weak excuse, and we all knew it. Mom sounded flustered and evasive on the phone, which only deepened my suspicions. It felt like she had been caught in a lie, or at least in something they had been deliberately hiding from me. Later that evening, she sent me a text, furious that I had gone to my grandparents behind her back. She accused me of betraying her trust and being completely out of line for letting them overhear our conversation without her knowing. According to her, I had acted selfishly. But was I really in the wrong for trying to find out what had happened to my college fund, money my grandparents had saved specifically for me? Update 1. Following the advice of many, my grandparents and I decided to confront my parents directly to get the full truth. When we arrived at their house, my grandfather wasted no time. He immediately demanded answers, asking why they had stopped paying for my college tuition when there had been a dedicated fund set aside for me. Dad tried to brush it off, mumbling something about how the money just wasn't enough to cover all my expenses. But my grandfather had come prepared. He pulled out a folder full of financial statements, proof of exactly how much money had been saved for my education. It was more than enough to cover all 4 years of college, with extra to spare. I couldn't contain my frustration anymore. I turned to my parents and asked them directly, "Why didn't you ever tell me about this fund? Why let me stress and panic over my tuition when there was money for it all along?" That's when Mom broke down. With guilt in her voice, she admitted that they had started using my college fund for other things over the years. First, they had taken money from it to cover Mia's repeated high school failures. Private tutors, special programs, even the fees for a private school, everything had been paid for using my fund. I had always assumed they were sacrificing from their own savings, but instead, they had been draining the money meant for my future. But it didn't stop there. Diane confessed they had also used the fund for several family vacations. And, as if that wasn't enough, they had bought Mia a new phone and even her current car using the same money. By the time they had covered my first 2 years of college, the fund was completely drained. But here was the worst part, Mia's college fund was still untouched. I was floored. I asked the obvious question, why not use Mia's fund to cover my last 2 years, especially since you already spent my money on her? Dad quickly jumped in, his voice full of misplaced reasoning. "You're the responsible one," he said. "You've always been the mature kid who figures things out. Mia's different, she struggles more. She needs that safety net." It was like they expected me to simply accept it, that my strength justified their betrayal. My grandparents, however, were livid. My grandmother flat out stated that if I wanted to take legal action against my parents for misusing the fund, she would fully support me. She reminded us all that what they had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was likely illegal. Mom and Dad panicked, scrambling for excuses. They claimed they had only done what they thought was best for the family, but their words rang hollow. That's when my grandfather stepped in again. He reminded them that years ago, he had given them the family house as a gift, so they wouldn't have to worry about buying one and could focus on raising their children. We helped you so you could help your kids, he said sternly, not so you could choose favorites and ruin one child's future to benefit the other. Then he made a decision that stunned everyone. He declared that he would be transferring the deed to the house from his name to mine. I would become the legal owner. If you want to stay here, he told Mom and Dad, you'll pay rent to Chloe. And that rent can go toward covering her college costs, since you've left her to figure it out on her own. The room fell silent. My parents were speechless. The look on their faces was a mixture of shock and dread. For the first time, they were being held accountable for everything they had done. In the days that followed, Mom and Dad begged my grandfather to reconsider. Dad even offered to sell me his car and dip into their personal savings to pay for my tuition. But my grandfather stood firm. For the first time in years, I felt like justice had been served. Update 2. Hey everyone. Sorry for disappearing these past 2 weeks. A lot has happened. For those wondering where Mia was during the whole showdown between my grandparents and parents, well, I didn't mention it before, but she was off celebrating with her friends at a lake house. And guess who footed the bill? Yep, our parents. Apparently, they thought the perfect reward for Mia finally graduating high school was an all-expenses-paid trip. When I confronted them about it, their explanation was almost laughable. They told me Mia needed to relax after all the stress she went through in high school. Really? Meanwhile, I was here stressing over how to pay for my college tuition, the same tuition that was supposed to be covered by the college fund my grandparents had set up for me, while they were blowing money on a luxury trip for Mia. The double standards? Unbelievable. Update 3. Now, onto some good news. My grandfather wasn't bluffing, he followed through with his promise. The deed to the house? It's officially in my name now. Yep, I'm the legal owner of our family home. The sense of empowerment? Honestly, I can't even describe it. After feeling so powerless for so long, it's a huge shift to finally have control. As expected, my parents are livid. They never thought there would be actual consequences. They assumed they could keep living in the house rent-free forever. But I laid it out clearly. They now have 2 options. Move out within a month or stay, and start paying me rent starting next month. No room for negotiation. Oh, how the tables have turned. And for those wondering about Mia, yes, she knows everything now. She had no clue about the college fund or how badly our parents mishandled it. Sure, a lot of the money went towards her schooling and, let's be real, some luxuries too, but she wasn't the one making those decisions. To my surprise, she's been incredibly supportive. When I told her what happened, she was furious at our parents. She couldn't believe how they had lied to both of us and misused the money our grandparents had saved. Having her on my side has been such a relief. It makes this whole mess a bit easier to handle. At the end of the day, I'm beyond thankful to my grandparents. I honestly don't have the words to express how much I appreciate them. Without their help, I have no idea where I'd be right now.